The goal that led him on was not impossible, so it was clearly supernatural. He wanted to dream a man. This is the premise of another mind blowing, reality bending short story by Jorge Luis Borges. Let's get this book undone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books Undone. I'm your host, Livia J. Elliot, and I'm here today with a number of guests to deep dive into another short story by Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. In this case, we are discussing The Circular Ruins, which is part of the collection titled Ficciones. But before we get started with the discussion, I will let my guests introduce themselves.
Thank you for having me, Livia. I'm Jared. I'm from the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel, Speculation Podcast, and you can find me on pagechewing.com as far as some other read-alongs and podcasts that I'm on as well.
Hi, I'm Jose. I run the Jose's Amazing Worlds of Fantasy YouTube channel and the Fantasy Talks Live podcast. For anyone that can speak Spanish, I run a similar channel called La Biblioteca Fantástica de Jose, and I can also be found lurking around the page chewing forums.
Hi, I'm Phillip Stuart. I'm author of the John King Saga. I'm also a booktuber. 6 Elemental Book Reviews TV series on my channel. You can also find me beside my partner, maybe between the pages, under the Page Chewing umbrella, the Page Chewing Interviewing series. And Before We Go blog as assistant editor for Goodreads reviews, etc.
I'm Chris, also over on YouTube under Fictional Escapist, and I run a storytelling podcast called Genre Blender with my friend Ryan.
Hi, I'm Phillip Chase. I have a YouTube channel, The Best of Fantasy, all about exploring fantasy, and I'm the author of the Edan trilogy and the recently released sequel, Wild Darkness Gathers.
So thank you all for coming in. And before we dive in, allow me to make some disclosures. First, there are spoilers in this podcast. This is a 6 pages short story, and it is virtually impossible to discuss its theme and meaning while avoiding spoilers. Second, we may or may not reference other Borges stories that we have discussed in this podcast. And third and finally, what you will hear is our subjective interpretation of the circular ruins. You may disagree with us, you may have your own opinions, and that's completely fine. I will get us started with a short and yet not so simple question. What did you think was the central theme of the story?
It's a loaded question because I feel like there's so many interpretations that could be gathered from 6 pages of just fantastic philosophical questioning that we have here. I think for me, the central theme was what is our place in the world and how do we act, how we go about our lives, our thought processes, how does that fit into our worldview? And then go on to create another person's worldview.
I love what Chris just said. Completely agree. I also agree with the idea that it's so richly symbolic that you could go in a few different directions with this. So another possibility is just to emphasize the act of creation here. And this is an exploration of what it means to create artistically, in addition to just being in the world and how we relate to other people and the nature of existence and the nature of consciousness as well. I think it's a fascinating exploration of that. It reminded me of a book I read called Gödel, Escher, Bach, The Eternal Golden Braid, which is an exploration of consciousness and how there's a circularity to consciousness and the way we perceive ourselves in the world. So it's just a really rich, beautiful story.
I agree with both of you guys. It really is. It's circular in its nature, and it brings out the circular nature of history and how things tend to repeat themselves in dreams. And I like how he uses dreams and compares how is knowing something related to dreams and imagery and the manipulation of memory and dreams and how they relate to each other. And I thought it was, like you said, it's very symbolic and very rich.
I interpreted it in a similar way with how circular it is, but about the person imagining a new version of themselves. You know, the classic or modern concept of reinventing oneself? Basically, like something happened and he created a new identity, adapted or something, and towards the end, it's himself, a dream of himself.
One of my favorite films is Inception by Christopher Nolan, and it's all about layers within a dream. And that very much came front of mind when I read this short story. So in my head, I had the main character who's creating this other person. He's within one layer of the dream, and then it's like a reality that's segmented and fragmented. So that bending reality and what reality really is. Are you simply part of someone else's dream? What is truly your level of real existence? That very much, those are some of the thoughts that came to mind when I read this story. But yeah, those were excellent thoughts by the other panelists here.
Borges is such a complicated writer. These short stories are very deep and profound. For me, it was a lot more specific than everything else you have all mentioned. Of course, it's got all those philosophical meanings that you all said. It can be open to many interpretations. But for me, it took on a very specific meaning, and it's something that Chris sort of touched upon when he was giving his interpretation of the story. To me, it was all about parenting. It just took on a very specific meaning because he's dreaming about a man, and he talks about teaching and having different kind of students that react differently to his teachings. And he dreams of a man. I think that's kind of as a parent, you hope your children will become to be. And then going back to that circular nature that Jared said, he realizes that he himself was someone else's dream. So he himself was someone else's child who may have been the realization or the failure to live up to those expectations that his own father may have had. That was how I interpreted the story. It was very, very specific. I don't know why it took me in that direction.
I really like that interpretation, Jose. In fact, it got me thinking a little bit too about how this is a story of a male engendering a male, and usually, of course, it's the female who brings life in such a manner. It was curious to me that Borges chose a male figure to bring life into the world in this way, and of course, it's through dreaming, slightly different process than giving birth, though he did have his pains during the journey. I thought that was an interesting thing just from a gender perspective as well here.
And what is interesting about that is that he goes through all of the quote unquote motherly phases of nurturing, teaching, then sends the child in quests to collect things and everything. I haven't thought about that. It's a very interesting take, Jose.
It might be a comment on the fact that, from a pragmatic perspective, as your male, you can only essentially create through something other than childbirth, right? You can create art, you can create other things, but you can't give birth to human beings. So, but one thing I also thought, and of course, I'm not an expert like my esteemed friend, Dr. Chase, in these matters, but, one thing that I do know about Buddhism is that there's a concept that everything in life is an illusion. We're just essentially living in an illusion. And that was something that definitely struck me about this short story. And I wondered if there's some famous stories where at the end there's an implication that she's just simply a character in the Red King's dream. There's so many literary works where it would seem that the main character is just living in this, is just part of this illusion that belongs to someone else. So I definitely found that was something I kept thinking about.
It's a concept that goes back to even like The Tempest, right? This idea that we're someone else's dream. So it's not necessarily original to Borges, but I feel like his story has been so influential too at the same time. And you mentioned Inception. I have to think that Christopher Nolan knew this story before making that film. But yeah, the concept you're talking about there in Buddhism and Hinduism is I think it's called Maya. The idea that everything is an illusion around us, that we're living essentially in a dream, that we are the products of some god's dream, and we're just kind of waiting for him to wake up.
There is also another detail, to me at least, with the end and with the final revelation, and it's that the protagonist thinks himself the first to be dreaming someone else. And at the end, he realizes that he's the next one dreaming someone else. And that made me think in terms of creativity, how many times we think we are the first one to propose an idea, to do something novel, and it's just the next take on it. It may have a unique quality, but it's just another product of it. And then it comes the realization of that chain of events.
I love that you said that, Livia, because I do feel that there is no way that anyone telling a story today is doing something entirely original. I think originality is often overrated. A lot of authors sometimes even hide or don't acknowledge their inspirations and influences, which bothers me sometimes because I feel like all of us owe our storytelling to those who came before. And the stories that we're telling are in a dialogue with these older stories. So the idea that we're not as original as we may have thought. Sometimes people who tell stories, we consciously nod to our predecessors, that we include little Easter eggs or something, little nods, little bows to our inspirations. But I think even more often, we don't even realize the various stories that are swirling around in here and are emerging in the course of our own storytelling in ways that we're unconscious of until someone maybe even says later, hey, this reminds me of this story. And you think, oh yeah, that was a very important story to me when I was a kid. Probably that came out and I didn't even realize, So I love the way you put that.
It's interesting. You always hear about writers created this, like Tolkien created this, and Howard created this and that, but they all got their ideas from other things, and it all blended in. And like the originality thing is, like you said, way overrated, because even these people that we look back to as original writers, they all had their influence, and then they all had their dreams to put down on paper.
I want to circle back to basically what Chris and Philip mentioned before in terms of consciousness and identity. If a protagonist can dream a man into existence, and he himself is later revealed to also be dream, what we were just discussing, what does that tell us about the nature of identity? Is identity tied to consciousness, or is it something deeper? Could it be like, for example, what Jean-Paul Sartre said, existence precedes essence? We craft the narrative of our identity after we are living, not before. What is your take on that?
I think that's a whole other conversation, isn't it? Because identity is not only how you think of yourself, but how other people perceive you, and they may assign an identity to you. I just got hung up with the whole parenting thing because I have these conversations with my wife. But those that don't know, my wife's black. We have mixed race kids in Spain. So my boys stick out like a sore thumb when we go out on the street. So, we have those constant conversations all the time. But then what does that mean? Because they are not black Americans. They were born in London, but they grew up in Spain. So to assign to them identities because of the color of their skin is just foolish. That their experiences are not those of black people from other parts of the world. It's very specific to them, but yet they are going to be perceived a certain way, even though internally they may see themselves as something else. And that's a big melon to cut and explore. But I think identity is not just about your self-perception, but also by others' perception.
The suggestion here is that identity is fluid, that it's not something that's fixed. It is, as Peel was alluding to before, it's in some way an illusion, that it's Maya, that this concept of the self is a narrative. And it's a flawed narrative at that, because we're probably missing a whole lot of facts and things, even in our own self-narratives, especially if it relies on memory, which is notoriously unreliable because we tweak our memories all the time. The idea that we have this fixed identity is an illusion. As Jose was saying, to a large degree, it depends on misperceptions and labels that are certainly imperfect and don't acknowledge the complexity of a person's fullness. So yeah, it's fascinating, I think, and that's a really excellent example, Jose, actually, of your sons being people who superficially other people see them and slap these labels on them, and they don't fit at all. That's the nature of the imperfect ways in which we try to solidify identity, which is fluid, and it can't be really realistically frozen that way. And of course, I think the dreamer realizes that at the end of the story, doesn't he? About himself and about the illusions of his own identity. Pretty much blown away by this revelation, the epiphany that, oh wait, I'm also someone that's dream.
Borges also brings in this aspect of the fire god and stuff like that. So he does bring in this magical realism, this sense that there is an outside force intruding upon his dreams in some way and intruding upon his creation. He mentions the Adam myth as well amongst this fire god and this wizard. He introduces an outside force of some sort that either suggest a manipulation of dream or at least influence of the dream on the dreamer. It's just a bunch of questions he brings up about how much of this is insular, as far as circular with the person dreaming and then realizing he was once dreamt, or how much the outside world influences our dreams and our creations going forward.
And one thing that struck me about this short story, and going back to Jose's point about perception and what influence others have on perception reality, so much of this, the short story I had this image of the main character in some kind of a Mayan or Aztec temple, and these people coming to feed him and nourish him and keep him alive so that he could accomplish this creation, right? So almost that in some ways I felt he was akin to a god himself, and that it was the belief of others that was keeping him alive so he could create. In other words, the same way without our belief in a deity or deity, the deity doesn't exist. We're the ones that feed that belief, and we're the ones that essentially create that deity. And then if we lose faith, then that deity no longer exists for us. But that allows that deity to create, to have power over us, and to influence us, and to answer prayers. It felt very much like that, and that. But as Jared said, there's this acknowledgement that there's other deities and there's other creators and there's other creations going on, and we don't know the extent to which these other creations exist, and we don't know our part in the entirety of creation. So, and I think that was something that, especially at the end, when the character realizes that they're just illusions themselves, but that illusion has been fed and nurtured the way they've fed and nurtured and created their son. I thought it was very interesting.
I would add to that, and I think in such a short story, every single line is written with a purpose. And I think in one of the lines, Borges makes a point of mentioning that this dreamer comes from the south, where the Greek influence was non-existent. So again, to the points you were all mentioning, it's about contrasting philosophies. Like he's bringing a new perspective to this land, which is why he's teaching people. And back to Philip's point about the Buddhist myth, bringing it to the classical Greek Roman philosophy. So something about the things to learn outside of our culture and heritage. And I think he makes a clear point that he comes from somewhere else where that influence was non-existent.
But sometimes, in order to change, we need to go away from places. Sometimes, if we are chasing a new version of ourselves, we need to leave things behind. And in that case, relocating will be a very literal interpretation, or simply purposefully leaving some things behind, like a group of people, a habit, or anything. It's like the key to enable the change and to dream that new version of ourselves in that sense. I loved what Bill mentioned about the people that are there supporting him, because when I read the story, I had Jose had the idea of parenting, and I had the idea of reinventing oneself, creating a new version. And I think that's fundamental, because we really need people supporting us whenever we want to create a new version of ourselves. People that will say like, yeah, you can pursue the new career, or yeah, you can study that, or yeah, you can learn how to write, or yeah, you can learn this or that. But without those people, it's virtually impossible. We lose the faith in ourselves.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, Livia, because I think it's actually empowering, the idea that we can forge our identities in that way and pursue them and seek our identities, because they're not fixed. That might be frightening to a lot of people, the idea that somehow this is all an illusion and all of that. But I actually think that your way of seeing it is really empowering, and I love that. So yeah, that's fantastic.
Something that I quite liked here, which we haven't touched upon yet, similar to what Livia was saying, was the idea that we need people around us, but sometimes we also need to take pause when we are looking at reinventing ourselves. And if I can read a couple of lines out where we are talking about the dreamer first, it says, at first his dreams were chaotic, and then in a short while they became dialectic. So they're investigating, they're discovering the truth of what's happening and trying to build that self. And then later on in the story, a couple of pages later, the dreamer has difficulty with conjuring images and conjuring these dreams. My reflection personally, because I have lived a couple of identities, so part of my upbringing and my worldview coming into the story here is that it was very important for me to go, I do need to take a minute. And then we had a period of 14 days we couldn't dream at all. And as soon as we stopped trying to dream, we were able then to go down that path again. And I thought that was really interesting.
It's interesting as well, because sometimes it doesn't matter how much we want that dream. Sometimes we really need to take a step back and double check with ourselves if we really want it, because sometimes it may be that things are not happening as we wanted. We get disappointed and we forget why we started chasing that thing. That pause sometimes is fundamental. There was a line that I particularly liked it's very in the first paragraph, I think. He says that, but in fact, the gray man had kissed the mud. So as soon as he arrived, he kissed the mud. And I thought, in the Spanish version, it says something different, but I thought, like, how desperate is he to just land on land and kiss the mud? Like, we would all rather stay in like a drier soil. So what happened to him to be so grateful of being on solid ground?
I think it's Samuel Beckett's quote that we try, we fail, we try better, we fail better, isn't it? And sometimes, yeah, things don't work out the way we intended, or we actually make a meal out of it. We need to take time out. We need to rethink strategy and then carry on ahead. I think it's a positive outlook. You try again, you go ahead, you just don't give up, you don't go back. And the failure is part of the process. My wife tells me pretty much every other day, we live and learn. We live and learn. It's just, you got to keep going.
That's reflected, I think, too, in the very last line, where it's a little ambiguous about how the dreamer feels about this revelation that he is someone else's dream. There's a sense of a little bit of horror, but also relief. If someone could read the last line, I don't have the story with me. I love the way that it's slightly ambiguous, but I feel like that goes back to the circularity of the whole story as well. Like, he's sort of, as Jose was just saying, he's emerging kind of where he started, but a little more enlightened.
He actually has a few mixed feelings in the Penguin version. It says, with relief, with humiliation, with terror, he realized that he too was but appearance that another man was dreaming him.
Yeah. Relief and terror.
Humiliation, terror.
Humiliation. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's interesting to me that connotes an idea of this is the first step to enlightenment, is knowing oneself a little bit there and understanding, okay, then I too am this. And from there, I think again that's actually empowering, even though there's that moment of humiliation there when understanding, oh wait, I'm someone else's dream too here. Yeah.
I just wonder, because I took it because it's the final line of the story and it does sort of accepting finality. I just wonder whether it's just talking about death and it's that moment where you accept that you're going to die, that's it. You've done what you had to do. The only thing I've got wondering in my mind is, what is that last wisdom that you acquire before you die? Or maybe that's the wisdom that you accept. This is it, and you've done your best. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what people think, but that's the interpretation I took. That last piece of learning just before we pass away.
So the line before that, he goes through the fire. What if the fire is just a figurative challenge? Once you go through the challenge, you become what you dream of.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it will be the death of the old self.
I love that, because I think that's also because the entire title of the story, the circular runes, everything returns to itself. Everything is, I mean, life is a circle. You start off and you kind of find yourself back where you were before. The concept of, once a man, twice a child. You're born as a baby, you're helpless. You become older, you're elderly, you're helpless. But also too, and to Jose's point about the intentionality of some of the efforts, and Phillip was talking about this too, the efforts to be original, the efforts to distance oneself from previous teachings or ideology. But so much of even the title Circular Ruins, there's mention in the book, in the story, I believe, of concentric. And I kept thinking Plato, because I'm a huge Plato fan. And Timaeus, again, is another one of those stories about dream or illusion. And I kept thinking that, as much as the author is in some way saying that, looking to strike out and do something original, creative, also in a way paying homage to the fact that, nothing is truly inventive, that everything comes from something else. And there's always a circling back. So I definitely, when I started reading certain lines and passages and words, it all kept bringing back to other works.
Almost every line in here brings up a question that Borges really leaves to us to wonder about. Even in the first paragraph, there's a whole bunch of talk about what nobody saw, but yet what everybody knew. So there's like this unwitnessed knowledge, basically, that's happening. And that includes just the stranger that we are introduced to. It just makes you ask, like, how is knowing things related to dreaming? And is dreaming something real also like knowing that it's real? Is that the same thing? I just love how the story brings up all those questions that he doesn't really answer it, but he leaves it out there to disseminate and try to figure out for yourself.
I got to that last line, and this is where the parenting analogy came in for me, probably in the reverse that I don't have children, but during my life, there was definitely a time when I had that real light bulb moment of my parents were just doing their best with what they had at the time. And I think that's such an empowering moment that all kids will go through as they get older, where they just go, they were just doing what they could with what they had. And now I get to learn from those lessons and continue on in the way that I want to live my life. So a little bit of a different interpretation, but getting that parental reference really sort of solidified for me towards the end.
I think that just the nature of the story leaves so much room for the different interpretations that the reader is going to bring to it. And he even has some metaphors in here of the impossible. Basically, he has this line about something being more difficult than weaving a rope out of sand or coining the faceless wind, like these impossible metaphors that dreaming is trying to put together and trying to create, but yet still slips through his fingers, even though it's just an illusion and it's just a dream. He's trying to make something real out of it, and even he has his limits. And so it's just so there's so much to read into that.
To Chris's point about the whole in the story, that main character tries at first to build a dream one way, fails, rests, and then starts another way. And just a reminder that, I think a lot of us who are parents, we always feel that, you're looking to be perfect, you're looking for perfection, you're looking to, give your child, imbue them with all the right ideals and all the tools to succeed. But it doesn't work like that. The child itself, they go in the world and they build upon knowledge from other people, and they have their own experiences. Human beings, life is constructed very differently than the way we as parents initially think. We think we're responsible for, everything, but yet in it's a process, right? And that's the one thing I read into when the dreamer succeeded in building the man versus when he failed, and that it's a process. It's not just boom, you create this perfect, fully fleshed out human being. It's something that happens over time, and it's a process.
To that point, which is great, and I think again back to the circularity of the story, talking about parenting and children, like you said, we cannot protect them, we cannot do everything for them. They have to try. In the story, he sends his dreamed man away, gives him tasks, isn't it? But at the end of the story, he realizes he's someone else's dream. So what if that someone else had sent him there, like he sends his dream man to the mountain or whatever it was? Like the thing is back to that circularity again, you can equip your children to give them basic tools, but they have to go and forge that path and be who they can be, and give them not challenge but task or opportunities to be. And he realizes he also got those, and we're back again, the same circular story. That story seems to be going round and round and round.
And earlier in the story, before the dreamer succeeds in engendering this next generation, there's a sequence of failures, and that includes actually this part where he had a whole classroom full of students, almost like an infinite classroom of students. It was interesting to me that it was the students who not just took everything he said, imbibed it without question, who showed the most promise. It was the ones who resisted, the ones who questioned. And this again goes back to what you were saying about parenting, how kids, they're not just going to be receptacles for our ideals and our ideas and what we project into them. They're going to interact with other people. They're going to have questions. They're going to rebel. They're going to assert, no, this is not what I want to do. I'm going to go this path. And that was interesting to me, that those were the students where the dreamer found the most promise, that they had the gumption to forge their own identities, to strike out on their own paths. So I thought that was a very significant moment along the way as well.
He actually says explicitly the accepting, so worthy of affection and a degree of sympathy, will never emerge as individuals. Like he's very specific as tying that rebellion to what make us an individual as well. But following on that, something that I found pretty interesting, especially if you take it with the flavor of parentage, is that he fails when he tries to go the logic route. So he tries to teach them, he says anatomy, cosmography, magic, and everything, and he fails. And he only succeeds when he dreams the sun by imagining the heart first. So is that an allegory to giving love first rather than education? I found that a very interesting
I like
question.
that. Yeah.
We're all nodding yes. So
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
For anyone not watching, there was just everybody's nodding their heads all the way around as Livia said that.
Yeah. What was interesting too was he also had to he wanted his son to never know that his son was a phantom. He wanted him to think of himself like a man like any other. He destroyed in him all memory of his years of apprenticeship. So in the forging of his son from a dream, he wanted his son to basically be like him, to think he was an original, real creator, an individual all on his own. I just love how he worded that. It was great.
Yeah, it's great that there's this implication that to succeed as an adult, you have to have this level of autonomy and separation, essentially to not be a carbon copy of your parents, to not even necessarily need to rely on your origins in your upbringing because you're this human being that you've evolved on your own in a lot of ways. The creator felt it was necessary to actually, have his creation not even know his origins, right? So, but that he could still stand on his own, and I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it kind of contradicts the idea of not being original. There's a lot of contradiction and contrasting in this story and comparing, and he does it all with this wonderful metaphorical imagery that just really makes you think a lot about this stuff.
it is paradoxical, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the idea that in acknowledging that we come from those who are before us is important, but at the same time, there's this process of forging our own identities, and I find that to be also really empowering and
Mhm.
pretty cool. But it's paradoxical. That there's an acknowledgement of both, and by the way, that it's all an illusion at the same time, which complicates it even more. And again, I think may feel scary in a way, but also it opens up so much possibility too, doesn't it? So I really love that. Once you adjust to that, instead of being frightening, it actually can be quite beautiful, I think.
Yeah, there's a question like, is it humiliating to be a projection of another's dream? Or is that something that he's accepting of in the very end there? That it's not. It's a continuation. It's that circular thing. But when you're young and you're rebellious, it can feel humiliating because you want to be your own person and stuff like that. So,
And it also feels as if, let's call it like the parent dreamer, at some point struggles to let go. Like there is some degree of enmeshment in there because he dreamed the son to be like him, gave him his own ideas and everything, and then slowly begins to set him on quests and going back there. And at the end, there is that whole reflection that could be seen as protectiveness. What happens if I let him go into the world? What happens if the world damages him? I thought it was interesting as well in the sense that it's a common struggle, the dichotomy of wanting another one to be individual, but at the same time protect them.
And that you could also even take that not literally, but more metaphorically, as let's say an artist creating a work of art or a writer writing a book and putting it out in the world and worrying about, oh my goodness, it's sort of like Kafka would write about something like this, right? And maybe like a hunger artist or something of that nature, where there's this anxiety about how will this thing I created be received and will it be understood by anyone? And probably not. It'll be misunderstood, mislabeled, and all kinds of abused in all kinds of ways. The anxiety of the creator, I think, just that touches on.
Following on that, the individuals that you mentioned before, Philip, that part in which he has all the students and only the students with original ideas emerge as individuals. We could also read that as an idea. So they are not individuals, they are ideas, and only the ideas that are uncommon and out of a box are the ones that are going to succeed. Sometimes names that end up being pretty renowned are the ones that brought up something fresh.
There also seems to be this concept that, and it's mentioned, essentially the fire god demands that the creation's education is only finished when he himself goes to another ruined temple downstream. So there may be this implication that you becoming fully realized, you achieving all you're meant to achieve, it doesn't happen until a certain juncture, and whether that's when you understand faith or whether you embrace your meaning or you embrace your diet, etc. There's some demarcation point. Until you do this, you're not, fully realized. And that I felt that very interesting. So it wasn't until the creation basically did the same thing the creator did or got to this certain point that they were fully realized or that their education or it would be complete.
I have to question that. Are we ever finished? are we ever fully realized? Every day brings something new. I don't think there's a point where we can say, oh yes, I'm an adult now, or I know what there is to know. And maybe I misunderstood you.
No. I think you're right, but perhaps there is an artificially imposed point. Maybe it's like saying, well, society always imposes these demarcation points.
Yeah.
You're this old, you can get your driver's license. You're this old, you can vote. You're this old, you can have consensual relations. You're this, like, we're always being told, now you're an adult when you can do this, right? So I don't know if that was the commentary that Borges was making. As I said, I'm throwing ideas out there that it seemed very interesting that the creation had to go to finish their education or proceed to the next level of their education. They had to leave and do the same thing that their creator was doing. So,
or is he just saying that your death moment when you go to that baptism of fire that Phillip said before, like you're only, like, you realize when you're dead, when you're about to, that's the moment when you can say, I've learned not all that there was to know, but all that you were going to learn in your life.
I'm going to go back quickly to that part. The commentary from the fire deity is that the conjures man, basically conjures man's education is finished when he goes to this other temple and says, so that this deserted edifice a voice might give glory to God. So the idea that now the temple is empty, and again, to your point, Jose, is he talking about, okay, well, now that he's dead, that's the tribute. I found that part very interesting.
There was a point in this book, in the story, that sort of follows on the same lines, PL, and it's a modern take. At one point, it reminded me of a self-help book called Stop Doing That, SHIT, by Gary John Bishop, when we're looking at the workforce and the nature of goal setting and what we do as humans when we are setting up for a goal. And there was a couple of points in the story where the dreamer says, with a certain bitterness, he understood that his son was ready to be born, and then perhaps impatient. And then further along that page, it says, his victory and peace became blurred with boredom. So we are ever chasing the next thing. And it's only until we come to that finality of, and I've just put a very non-profound note saying positive nihilism question mark at the end of the story, where we go, I've done what I can do, and I'm done now.
I love that because I think we are always chasing something else, but at the same time, the goals we are chasing generally and largely depend on things that are outside of our control. We seek the acceptance of others. We seek to be famous. We seek to, I don't know, get the next promotion. And all of that depends on somebody else. The only thing that is always within our control, it's to do our best at every point. But it's like Chris said, we're always wanting more and more. And when I read The God of Fire, I did a more metaphorical take. What if it's passion? What if it is a reference to being passionate about something because it is fire? And in that case, it could be for something that interests us, or the passion to create something or to share something.
This idea of the history being circular and the circular nature of life that he's talking about in here, it brought up a lot of questions for me at the end, in that, should we fear the future when we already know the past? Because life is circular. Should we not already know how things are going to progress? So what is there to worry about? We already know that things are circular and they're going to progress in a certain way. How does that relate to the ambitions and goals that we set for ourselves? I think it's up in the air. I don't think there's anything answered at the end of the story. I think that's for us to wonder about, but I think it does bring up all those questions.
Knowing where we're going, that we're going to be born, we're going to die, we're going to start off young, try and strive for all these accomplishments, only to grow old and to have our accomplishments we might not necessarily achieve what we want, or they may fade into obscurity. Then what are we striving for? Why do we work so hard towards all these goals? But that's what we're driven to do. Even if it is all an illusion, even if it is transient, even if it is, that's what we as beings are driven to do. We're driven to create. Even if the creation itself it comes to fruition, is going to ultimately be destroyed. Like, our children are going to die. They're going to grow old and die too, right? Like, we're still driven to create and strive towards all these things. At the end of the story, when creator realizes that he is just an illusion. Knowing what he knows, would he have done anything differently? And I think what we're just saying is that not necessarily. We're going to do it anyways. We're going to strive anyways.
I think he would strive to do something differently, but end up still doing something that ends up still being the same result. You know what I mean?
I have a question for you all about the fire god before we move into other topics. I actually found this, it's an interview with Borges in a magazine called Solares on 1976. So it's like roughly 20 something years after this story. But he's speaking about God, and it made me think about what he truly meant if these were his beliefs. So Borges said, regarding God, I am afraid to believe in God because we humans always believe in God only due to self pity and self compassion above all else. It is horrible, shameful that self pity lead us to invoke God. So when I read that interview, he's not speaking about the circular ruins. He's not mentioning any short story. I thought like, what if the mention to the fire god is just a cry for help? Because at that point, the protagonist feels that he's powerless or not capable of doing something, even so, because of all the cases he has had until that point, because he has failed. What if that's the ultimate cry before he gives up?
Well, in terms of the idea that that our conception of God is somehow linked to self-pity, he's right to the degree that when you see a lot of people turn to God in times of desperate need, or as they age, they're not particularly religious, but as they get closer to their, realizing, hey, I'm gonna not be around a whole lot longer. Suddenly, that's when people maybe think more about God, that kind of thing. So I think he's onto something there in terms of the way people conceive of God and relate to this conception of God. There is a kind of selfishness to it. I don't think that's the only way, though, that one could conceive of God or interact with one's conception of God. There are obviously other ways. And I feel like he himself gives us an example in this story that this is not purely the dreamer being a self-pitying person. This is the dreamer trying to, I think, realize something important, which is creativity, and in relation with something that is larger than himself, that there is something vast and large and empowering, and tapping into that in order to create is maybe one of our most important purposes. So I think Borges gives a kind of a refutation to his later expression of there's another way, and it's a much more, I feel, humble and yet creative way, less self-centered, sort of giving oneself over to that divine urge to create and tapping into something much larger than our own egos, our own conception, our own little self-narratives. So there's a possibility of transcendence in relation to the divine as well, that the dreamer, even though he realizes that he too is a dream at the end, he has succeeded to the degree that he has conceived of this child who has gone out into the world and is continuing this quest for meaning.
There's also always that concept that the whole idea of creation is self-pity, is this selfish desire for immortality, to live beyond our small mortal life, that when we create, when we give birth, that your piece of art, your book, your child survives beyond that. I think so much of the concept of there being something more than us, there being other realities, there being other creations, there being a deity or an overseer that is still going to be there when we're long gone. I think perhaps that's something that Borges was writing about. But I do think, though, that when it comes to creation, it seems to also give a power to the person, to us, that perhaps makes us feel really special. There's this concept of, the fact that we're provided that opportunity makes us special, makes us worthwhile. But yeah, I found all of those thoughts were ruminating in my head.
The word creation is a part of the word procreation. And so it really is in our DNA to create, because we want to continue on. We want to continue on our species and our existence, and in some manner, one way or another. I know Phillip's brought this up a lot, but we're storytelling creatures. And that storytelling is also a part of that creation to continue on. And it's in our genetics. It's part of who we are.
We even storytell our own identity, right? The narrative
Mhm.
of our life and who we are. That's also a narrative.
That creative process possibly is the main thing that distinguishes us from animals. We're all born, procreate, and die. And if we didn't create in the process, we would just be another part of the animal kingdom. And we need that creative process to fulfill ourselves. And back to the God point is because maybe without it, it's hard to accept that sort of speck in the universe that we are. And people seek meaning in different ways. And maybe people find fulfillment and realization through the creative process, and maybe through a belief in a deity, combination of both, if you're lucky, I suppose. What he's talking about is just basically just the human essence, isn't it? It's about humanity as we are.
I've got a few notes on faith and the concepts that were written throughout the 6 pages. And I think faith is such a huge and wonderful tool for people. It can be weaponized, but it can also be used to enhance somebody's life to the nth degree. And it's up to the person and their interpretation of that faith, of that God, of that deity, to either enrich their lives or make them miserable. I had throughout the text here that there's an element of the creator and the dreamer of feeling godlike in certain aspects of the story, where he is the creator and then he gives that power to somebody else. And again, we return back to that cyclical nature of the story and of faith, because we see it a lot. So interesting that it sometimes can come from pity, but I think it's also very powerful in a positive sense for a lot of people as well.
He did have some spicy takes on faith and religion in some of the other interviews, but he's also kind of like not appealing to any religion. He's using fire, which is, if you go to ancient times, they will worship fire, they will worship water and things like that. So is he perhaps resorting to something more primal, or was he perhaps trying to stay away from any modern concept of God, or whatever name you want to put it, purposefully for one particular meaning?
I find it curious now that you're asking this question that this god seems to be ambiguous as well in terms of its form. We're told that initially that it could be a horse or it could be a tiger. What? These two things are not that similar, really, are they?
And one is an animal that's generally used for work, and the other one is a predator. So it's pretty
Exactly.
different.
Very different. And so the multifaceted nature of the divine, the thousand faces of God here we're getting in that sense. So it's an encompassing view of the divine, I think, that we're getting by having it be literally different faces that can serve different purposes. And as we relate to the divine in different ways, that's a pretty clever move on the part of Borges. And I think it takes on even more forms. But ultimately, the primal form of it is, as you say, Livia, is fire, which, of course, is highly symbolic here. And there's so many things we can say about fire as both a creative and a destructive force, but as certainly a purifying force, as something that is just encapsulates that primal energy. Out of the destruction comes creation as well. Yeah, it's really cool what he does with this god in here, I think.
Yeah, and you can also add the historical take, because perhaps fire was the single most important discovery in the history of humankind, right? It enabled almost everything else that came after. That can also be something. Perhaps this is the only thing, or the primal thing, that enables everything else this man is going to dream.
Yeah, our ability to manipulate fire, nature, again, one of the things that distinguishes us, as Jared was saying, and Jose, that we are the storytelling creature, and our a capacity to imagine, but also our capacity to manipulate. We have these really cool opposable thumbs here, and this enhanced cranial capacity that these things enable us to manipulate the world around us. So that's also part of the identities that we've forged in the world. But the ability to manipulate fire, essential in our evolution as a species.
The importance of fire also would lead us to give it these aspects, because it's such an important thing to our species that we impose aspects upon it and give it properties that feed our own imaginations and storytelling.
And at the same time, it can get out of our control. It sometimes does, and it can burn us, right? When we get too big for our britches, so to speak, we get arrogant. Sometimes the fire can remind us, oh, no, you're not as in control as you think.
Which leads to even more stories and bigger aspects to it.
True. Another question I have for you all is that we have so far interpreted the story in a very individualistic way. So, one man imagining or dreaming his own son, or one man imagining or dreaming like a creation of his own. But what if they are metaphorical? What if this is one generation dreaming the world that will come for another generation? A lot of the social change in our history has come because a group of people wanted a different world for their offspring or even for themselves. So they thought to rebel, they tried to bring a new social order or to surface problems so that the new world will be different. So, what if this man that is dreamed is in actuality a generation and he's dreamed of because he is the result of a dream of a previous generation?
I have to agree because so many times there have been conflict or events, catastrophes that make the human race believe that the world is ending, whether that's the end of the Mayan calendar, Y2K, floods and famine, the Black Plague in medieval times, you name it. So typically, oftentimes, that belief the world is ending, it stems from societal anxiety or religious texts. There's always this belief that when it happens and we end up, oh, we're still here. Oh, we really need to do something different. We need to change everything. We need to deconstruct society. We need to do things differently. We need to atone for our sins. We need to recreate or do better. There's always this, okay, oh, we weren't destroyed. Okay, now we have to do better. But invariably, then every time it happens again, okay, well, we need to do better again. And there seems to be this cycle of always believe that we can create something better, that we're going to create something better, but yet we're not satisfied with the better, and we believe that whatever state we're in, even in the next better, it's still problematic. It can still bring about our destruction. We say, okay, we're going to put a cap on nuclear weapons so we can't destroy ourselves, but yet we still think we're going to destroy ourselves because some people still will create nuclear weapons despite the agreement not to, right? I think it's really interesting that we always think that society is evolving, we're coming closer to utopian, but yet every time something shakes us out of that and we think, oh no, the world's gonna end now, climate change, whatever it is, and then we survive, oh, we're gonna do better, but then it doesn't seem to reach that level that we're hoping.
Yeah, that's true. And we always tend to think the worst of ourselves. No, we never expect that the world will be better after. No, it's always worse. And I think that's also perhaps what he's imagining here. Perhaps he's trying to dream something better. So I have one more question for you, and this one may be a bit of a reference to Plato's cave. Borges has a tendency to blur the lines of fiction and nonfiction. For example, Tron, Ukvar, or Tertius is a pretty nice reference to how we create a fiction within the nonfiction reality. So, what if none of this was real? What if the dream wasn't real? What if he was just trapped somewhere and the dream was just a dream? What will happen? How will that change the meaning of the story or the importance of the achievement this man had?
Yeah. There were several points in the story where it seemed like the illusions of the dreamer was trying to reassemble what isn't real. There is that doubt that this guy's just trapped somewhere and he's just thinking about these things. He's trying to dream of something because he doesn't want to just die alone somewhere and have no significance. And so he's dreaming this stuff in order to have some sort of significance, some sort of carrying on as anyone would want to do. And I think that's reflected in sometimes how the dreams fall apart and they don't coalesce the way he wants them to. And so he continues on until he believes he's successful. But there could be that aspect that none of this is real. This story is incredible, I think, in that respect.
But doesn't matter though.
Good question, yeah.
This is the problem, isn't it? And it's the point I made before. At the end of the day, was our lifetime in the infinite, ever-expanding universe, in this planet that spins on itself around the sun, that moves across it? We don't matter. We are insignificant, isn't it? our lives are important to us, but in the great cosmic horror, we are nothing, which is what Lovecraft, sort of figured out 100 years ago. Going back to the parenting, our children's lives are important to us. So whether fiction or not, that's still our reality.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jose. What does it matter? It matters in this moment. While we're here in the light, trying to make meaning of this moment. And it may be all a delusion. We may be deluding ourselves, but I think we have to live as if we're not, as if it does matter in this moment. And that's about all we can do.
Because that's the only thing we have, the present. And if it matters in the present, then it matters.
And I think it's the interconnectivity of the entire experience. It's the interconnectivity of from one generation to another through hundreds of generations, through the dawn of existence. Everything matters, right? It matters that somehow miraculously, whether you believe in divine creation or the Big Bang theory, the earth is here. It matters that at one time there were dinosaurs and there were no humans. It matters that one day we may travel into outer space and populate other galaxies. It all matters. It's all interconnected. So, and we don't truly know what our relevance is. One of us could discover a cure for some disease that saves, countless lives, that ends up saving the universe. We just don't know. We don't know what that, because our lives are so finite. We don't know what our real purpose is or what our real value is or what our real we seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, just like Jose said. We seem to be just quick flash in the pan, but are we? We don't really know, because we don't understand the meaning behind even why we're here in the first place. We can't even definitively say why we're here.
I think that invites the question of what matters to you as a human, and hold on to that. Because my wife is a very big believer, and well, not believer, but very big fan of conspiracy theories. And she said she saw one day that said, "We're all a dream. Humanity is a dream of some alien race. We don't exist. We just think that we do. So make your time count." And I think that is where my positive nihilism question mark came in at the end of the story, where if nothing matters, then hold the people you love close. Go and do the things that you want to go and do and make it matter to you.
That's excellent, Chris. On that note, and before we wrap up, would you like to remind the readers of where they can find you, your books, your channels, everything?
You can find me at the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel. You can find me on Speculative Speculation podcast, and you can find me on several other podcasts, Film Chewing, Panel Chewing. Find me on the Page Chewing forums.
The books, plstore.com, Before We Go blog, and Goodreads for reviews. Social media, almost everything, all the handles, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter /X, and Blue Sky are all PL Stuart Writes.
You can find me over on YouTube at The Fictional Escapist, and that's pretty much across the board on social medias. And I do have another podcast called Genre Blender, and if you want to go down the website route, that is genreblender.net. That's a bit more exploratory of many different types of storytelling.
Yeah, I can be found my YouTube channel, Jose's Amazing Worlds of Fantasy. My podcast, Fantasy Talks Live, where I interview authors, literary agents, people from the industry, try to hold book discussions as well. And anyone that speaks Spanish, similar content on my Spanish channel, La Biblioteca Fantástica de Jose, and of course over the pagechewing.com forums.
Yeah, so once again, Phillip Chase, the best of fantasy here on YouTube. I am Phillip Chase 90 on other social media. And my books can be found anywhere online, the physical books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble here in the States, but other online retailers in other countries. As far as the physical book, also there's a special edition by the broken binding of the first book, and the second one should be coming out soon. And yeah, that's pretty much me.
Perfect. And that said, if you like this episode, please like and subscribe, review the podcast, and let's continue the discussion in the comments. If you want bite-sized deep dives, prose analysis, and more, please subscribe to my newsletter, Books Undone, through my Substack at liviajelliot.substack.com. As a bonus for subscribing, you will get the free book of my novella titled The Genesis of Change. It is grim, it's dark, and its magic system is based on philosophy. I will leave a link to subscribe to my newsletter in the description, alongside with links to all the books that we mentioned here. Thank you for listening and happy reading.